keeping all those things in mind, the sense that, race is largely not based in biology, but it's a very powerful social construct that we have empowered in this country for centuries. It's resulted in different groups having different amounts of social resources. It's resulted in different groups being more likely to experience racism, and those components associated with it, prejudice and discrimination. Then what your textbook then says about the gender strategies related to race hopefully will make a lot more sense. So we begin with African Americans, and they talk about how, and they start with African American men, and they say there's been a history of changing stereotypes because they've used stereotypes about Black men to justify everything from them being slaves to them being seen as threats, especially to white women and white women's virtue. During the Jim Crow era, where we saw this huge spike in lynchings. It's been used to justify their limits being placed on their ability to hold certain jobs, to live in certain neighborhoods, to do certain types of work. And to even in contemporary society, this idea of being dangerous and being violent and violence prone, being, those justifications for everything, for, your textbook mentions how we perceive young Black men in school to how Black men are perceived and treated by the police. So specifically thinking about it in terms of gender terms, we've already discussed, Black men are more likely to be stereotyped as hypermasculine. Gender strategy that they refer to as dangerous Black man. And I give you a reading about that if you want to explore that a little more. That author titles it Thug Masculinity, right? So we talked about hypermasculinity when we were in the masculinity chapter. But for African American men, hypermasculinity can be very dangerous, with a lot less upside than even what you see when hypermasculinity is put into practice by white men, because of those kind of cultural stereotypes around who's threatening, who's dangerous, who should I fear. So the idea that they're stronger, they're more aggressive, they're more violent, and even when this is taking place in arenas like sports, right? They're a more athletic player, they're stronger, they're beast. Those stereotypes have real societal repercussions. And your book talks about that, particularly in regards to the relationship between this idea of Black men and racial profiling and police brutality. So one survival strategy is the enactment of docility, right? Of emphasizing that you're docile, that you're friendly, that you're not a danger, that you're not a threat. They give the example of the guy that whistles Vivaldi when he's walking by himself at night, so that largely white people are not frightened by him, because the idea would be like, oh, a thug would never know, opera. And so they refer to this as the gentle Black man strategy. So basically, in order to be safe, Black men who do hegemonic masculinity, and certainly Black men who do hypermasculinity, do so at their own risk. So they have to almost feminize certain aspects of themselves, in order to be more culturally safe and appealing. And so that's their strategy. That is a strategy. For African American women, similar to Black men, there's a lot of historical motivations at play. Unlike white women who are considered to be dainty and to be vulnerable and to be pure, during slavery and the time period afterwards, Black women were characterized as being the opposite. Being tough, being sexually permissive and promiscuous, being able to, work like a man. And of course, all of these justifications were, what allowed people to not feel like they were attacking Black women's femininity, their womanness, by enslaving them, by having them do hard labor, hard manual labor, by sexually harassing and assaulting and raping them for centuries. And so, in the same way that Black men are stereotyped as hypermasculine, African American women are also masculinized. They're associated with hypersexuality and physical toughness, traits that we oftentimes associate with men. And I think your book puts it in a great way when they say a Black woman's race interferes with people's perception of her as feminine. They talk about, okay, how can African-American women push back against this? Well, they say that, the girly girl strategy can sometimes be harder for Black women to adopt when compared to the tough gal. And they say, phenotype does come into play here, that the more African a woman looks, the further she gets away from that kind of normative white woman model of femininity, the long hair, the small build, the small body, the thin lips, then the harder it would be for her to employ the girly girl strategy, certainly without maybe turning to resources like really expensive weave, plastic surgery, contouring lips and that type of thing, contouring noses. So it would be easier for them to just adopt, the tough gal strategy. And that tough gal strategy, especially for Black women, really taps into some stereotypes, that have differing levels of kind of embedded insults contained within them. Strong Black woman versus angry Black woman. And then your book talks, unlike single moms of other races, particularly white women who can call upon the super mom strategy, Black women, even when their social class is not poor, are more likely to find themselves stereotyped as welfare queens, a stereotype that is not applied nearly as much to any other group of people. A stereotype, which I would like to say flies in the face of the data that we often have about who is committing welfare fraud in some of our largest welfare fraud cases. And so all of this just means that, how Black women navigate their gendered strategies, is a lot more difficult. And so they talk about one kind of positive alternative that Black women have embraced when the girly girl strategy is not available or is not a good fit for them, is the Black is beautiful. And this is that idea of kind of renegotiating what is considered feminine within the race, so it does not have to be things like sleek straight hair, or things like thin nose or thin lips. And I have a picture there of Issa Rae because her very popular TV show Insecure, if you've ever watched it, she rocks natural hair in a variety of ways, and this idea that this other type of beauty is beautiful too, that Black beauty is beautiful as well, and you can be beautiful and you can be feminine without caving into those beauty norms that seem a lot more aligned with a white definition of beauty. Now, if African Americans, both men and women, are overly masculinized, then when talking about Asian Americans, they are both over feminized. So for Asian American men, they are oftentimes perceived as deficiently masculine, is the way that your book describes it. And so, why is that? Part of it, of course, has to do with some differences in like size, height. Asian American men are assumed to be smaller, lighter, less muscular than whites. Um, uh, Especially because in our country, the large number of first generation Asian Americans that come on the basis of like work and school visas, so they are stereotyped as being nerdier, more serious, more studious, dorkier than what the hegemonic male would be. This perception is also rooted in history. Your book talked about how when particularly the Chinese came to work on the railroads and to participate in the gold rush in California and other Western areas, and then they suffered from racism, and the country decided to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited Chinese from immigrating into America after that, including females. So basically, they created like a whole generation of Chinese men who were forced into bachelorhood. And so it kind of demasculinized them. They weren't they weren't afforded this ability, to do heterosexuality because they were kind of cut off from suitable mates. Because of course they also passed laws that made racial intermarriage with Chinese men illegal in a lot of those Western states. So, there's that historical component. And so they have these racial stereotypes similar to Black women that interfere with their ability to conform to gender expectations. Because, you think about that hegemonic male ideal, there are all these stereotypes of Asian men that pretty much position them as being the opposite of that. So the strategy that they say some Asian American men then engage in is what they call the assertive Asian strategy. Being outgoing, being gregarious, being assertive, being almost aggressive, being pushy. And kind of doing hegemonic masculinity to the point of almost being hyper masculine, but it's never quite perceived as being hyper masculine because their Asian identity kind of strips some of the masculineness of their gender expression away. I give an example from 13 Reasons Why, the fact that they had this Asian character, but his Asianness was not really a crucial part of his identity, of how he was presented. He was presented as largely being, in a lot of ways, like all the other football players, baseball players, jocks that he surrounded himself with, although the other guys were all white or Black, but his character was very similar in terms of personality. Then Asian American women, they are also feminized, and your book talks about this as hyperfeminization, what they call the Oriental flower strategy. So for Asian American women, they are seen as being, submissive, passive, demure, sexually available. And your book notes that, once again, a lot of this is based in history. It has a lot to do with, the popularity of Asian prostitution, more like sex slavery that existed in Chinatown and went unchecked for a very long period of time. The comfort women that American soldiers interacted with without really thinking about, kind of practical realities behind those women's lives. The kind of the fantasy of the, Japanese, geishas and all of that just kind of contributing to this idea of them being hyper feminine, going beyond even emphasized femininity, especially in contemporary society where less women are doing emphasized femininity. Asian women are stereotyped as being hyper feminine. And this certainly plays into kind of their appeal in the dating market, particularly to people who are not Asian themselves. And I give you a video if you are interested more in that dynamic. So their strategy, they also can do the assertive Asian strategy that requires them to be, more aggressive and pushy and dominant. But your book does note it's more difficult for them to employ because it's less culturally recognizable when they do that. When Asian American men do that, it is much more recognizable, like, oh, he is enacting the hegemonic male ideal. But when an Asian American woman does that, because we don't expect women to be that assertive, if they're being overly assertive, it can be hard for people to kind of characterize and respond, to what they're doing. I give the example of Ali Wong, who I think is hilarious, but I certainly, read reviews of her work, and some people were very turned off by how graphic she was, how graphically she spoke about bodily functions and particularly men and sex. And when I read those reviews, I remembered thinking, like, there are white and black female comedians who are just as graphic. I think it really was because she is Asian, and there was this sense that this is especially unexpected for her. And people weren't sure how to respond. Which brings us to white Americans. Your book notes that they are what's called racially unmarked. So what does that mean? In the same way that, with gender, we talked about how, men are gender invisible, right? That we assume that a lot of things, doctors, police officers, firefighters, we assume that they're men. And so we don't have to remark upon the maleness of those positions, right? The expectation is my doctor is a man, my police officer is a man. But that when women do those things, right, that their gender becomes very visible. And we therefore say, oh, that's a woman cop, or I have a female doctor. We remark upon it. In the same way, we have this assumption that when we say American or normal American or everyday American or average American, we are talking about a white, Christian, middle class, heterosexual individual. And we don't have to remark upon those qualities because those are the qualities that we had expected. So because white Americans are racially unmarked, they're considered to be normal, and thus they're normally gendered. They're the gender expectations that we have been comparing every other group to are the gender expectations that rise out of this group's history, the perceptions around this group, the kind of desires and preferences that originate in this group. And so this means that there are a range of gender strategies that they can adopt if they choose and have the resources, because they aren't having to necessarily work extra hard to prove masculinity or femininity. So they have a little bit more freedom in doing gender in a variety of ways, because their masculinity and femininity is less likely to be immediately questioned compared to like Asian American men or, African American women. Now there is a risk here. I mean, it's a stigma. It's a small stigma, and I'll say this: it's largely on a societal level pretty insignificant. It certainly isn't the same level of significance as your race making you a target for police brutality. But it's probably not significant on an individual level in terms of how people feel it when they're living their day-to-day lives. And that is the stigma of, because you are racially unmarked and your gender strategy is largely considered to be the normative gender strategy, then you run the risk of being seen as regular, boring, or uninteresting. And so there, it kind of becomes, I don't want to say an imperative, but if you want to push back against that boring, uninteresting, regular kind of stereotype, then you have to adopt a gender strategy that is meant to be different, distinction, right? Because racially you aren't distinctive. You adopt this strategy to make yourself more distinctive, scarier, more unique, in a group. And so those types of strategies, things like goth, they mentioned tough gal, or particularly tough gal in terms of being a wannabe. Um, these types of strategies are set apart from the all-American guy, all-American girl, because that's kind of the normative strategy. The all-American guy is basically the hegemonic ideal, and the all-American girl, although that has fluctuated a little bit as we've moved from the 50s and 60s, where there was this expectation of doing emphasized femininity, to this decade, where we do expect all-American girls, to care about their appearance, but perhaps to be athletic, to care about their appearance, but to be headed to college and to be good students and want careers. I think the key there that remains consistent is that expectation that they're going to care about their appearance. But if that's not the strategy, so that is a very easy strategy for white men and women, young men and women, to uphold. If they want to reject that strategy because they consider it to be boring, then there are these other possible, strategies, goths and tough gals, and for white guys, you maybe could think about gangsters, right? There are other strategies you can probably think of and find evidence for beyond the ones that your book even discusses. So then our next social identity is sexual orientation. This is the component of sexual identity that classifies sexual partner preference. We traditionally have been using a threefold categorization, but like gender, this is really more of a continuum. And certainly, the threefold categorization of heterosexuals, homosexuals, and bisexuals, that's just a very nifty, convenient way to characterize, who people are attracted to, who people seek to be in relationships with. Your book introduces the term sexual minorities, and you can think of that as being kind of the umbrella term for homosexuals, who would include gay men and lesbians, bisexuals, but then we also have newer terms, pansexual, where your sexual preference and interest kind of goes beyond, labels related to sex and gender identity. And then asexuals, people, who do not experience sexual preference, or do not identify as being a person that has consistent sexual preferences, or not even maybe consistent in the sense of experiencing sexuality in that type of way. Gender and sex identity is not the same thing as sexual orientation. We will have a later chapter where we discuss sexual orientation in more detail. But just know that you cannot tell someone's sexual orientation. We oftentimes say that, like, oh, my gaydar, oh, I knew that person was gay. But, what we're really doing there is we're conflating gender, particularly gender expression, with someone's sexual orientation. And in a lot of cases, we're just as likely to be wrong as we are to be right. So why do we do that? Part of the reason is in our society, a lot of people feel like they have to hide their sexual orientation. And that's because, if they're a sexual minority and they're out and they're open, depending on, the area of country that they're living in, they can experience heterosexism, which is, of course, when there is individual or institutional bias against sexual minorities. And and the pressure on even having to come out is because we live in a society that is defined by what's called compulsory or compulsive heterosexuality. The assumption is people are heterosexual, that part of being a man and part of being a woman, we define it by you then being attracted to the opposite sex. Right? So we build it into our definitions of manness and womanness. We build heterosexuality into those definitions. And so that means that for people who are not heterosexual, there is this just overwhelming expectation that they are, and so because to come out as being a sexual minority is a process, and like I said, it does have some inherent dangers associated with it. Some people do not come out. And they talk about, one related gender strategy is what they call the not too queer strategy. In which case, it's not so much that they're hiding their sexual orientation, but they aren't emphasizing it in a lot of ways or in a lot of spaces. And your book mentions that that has a lot to do with the fact of them fearing prejudice and bias and discrimination. And they would receive those things, in a society that is, heteronormative, a society that is designed around the idea that everyone is heterosexual. But if they don't want to hide it, then there are other strategies that they can employ. They talk about the recognizably butch strategy, and they relate that obviously particularly to women, so that people by your gender expression can make that assumption, you're encouraging them to make that assumption, that thus perhaps giving you the opportunity to confirm it if asked, as well as the strategy of queer, just once again making it clear that you are a member of the LGBTQ community or an ally in some shape, form, or fashion. And that relates to, the concept that your book calls homonormativity, which is the practice of obeying most gender rules with the noted exception of the one that says we must be sexually, interested in the opposite sex. So people who are embracing the recognizably butch and queer strategies are rejecting both heteronormativity as well as homonormativity, while a person who is doing the not too queer strategy, by the definition of their sexual orientation, although they're rejecting heteronormativity, in a lot of ways they're still upholding homonormativity, because except for their sexual identity, they are still embracing and upholding all those other gender norms. Now, once again, like all of these identities, you aren't experiencing this in isolation. So your book does have some discussion about how race can come into play here, as well as how nationality can come into play, because of course all of these things, for nationality, of course, is built on a very specific kind of cultural context. So people's ability to kind of understand that context is going to be based on their knowledge of the culture. And then just for race, they mention the fact that people who are already a racial minority and face those challenges and risks, that if they also then choose the recognizably butch or queer strategy and therefore kind of publicly kind of out themselves as a sexual minority, they're kind of just, adding to their risk of being discriminated against, their risk of facing prejudice, perhaps even their risk of being the victim of violence. And so all of that's just to say that it isn't just their own personal motivations that might lead them to accept or reject a gender strategy like recognizably butch or queer.